So in the NFC North, developing story, the Green Bay Packers have dropped 2 straight games to New York run franchises. They dropped the game against the Giants in London, and they just lost to the Jets, which kind of puts them behind the 8 ball to the Minnesota Vikings, who are 5-1 and already have a head-to-head victory against the Green Bay Packers. I guess the question is, have the Minnesota Vikings already wrapped up the NFC North?
Not wrapped up, but more likely than not, they will win. And this is actually the first week that I've actually started to contemplate the possibility of the Vikings winning that division, because I know the Vikings are 5-1 headed into their bye week. They're 4-2. They should have lost that game to the Lions. That was just a weird result. They should be a 4-2 team that happens to be 5-1 at this point. And that's just better for evaluating what the team is in terms of like what's going to happen when they get to the playoffs more than it is what's going to happen when they win the division. 5-1 versus 4-2 is a huge difference when we're talking about what's going to happen in the division. So this is the first week I'm contemplating that's like, hey, it's more probable than not that Minnesota is going to win that division, and they're probably going to win the division. I mean, not necessarily the last week of the season, but like they're going to win the division and possibly have a chance to rest people if they don't care about seeding. Like that might be a situation Minnesota finds itself in. And this is the first time I've actually contemplated that possibility, because in my mind, I've kept saying it's the same Minnesota team. It's the same Minnesota team. It's the same Minnesota team. And quite frankly, it might be the same Minnesota team. It's just the Packers are not really great at anything. The Packers are just like good to average at a lot of things. And that's, just been kind of the biggest surprise I've seen so far this season is like they almost lost to the Patriots. They did lose to the Giants, and they lost to the Jets, and the Jets kind of smoked them. Like that's kind of been the adjustment for myself more than what the Vikings are doing well.
Stacking up the position groups, Vikings versus the Packers, obviously, we know we give the edge to them at quarterback with Aaron Rodgers, but you look, Dalvin Cook, compare him to Aaron Jones or A.J. Dillon in a vacuum. Dalvin Cook probably has the edge there. Wide receivers, no contest. I mean, Adam Thielen and Justin Jefferson compared to the current state of the Green Bay Packers wide receivers. Tight end, I like Irv Smith Jr. more than returning from injury Robert Tonyan. The offensive lines, the Vikings offensive line is worse, but they vastly improved since last season. And the defenses, it's weird that the Vikings defense is better this year than last year, given that last year, obviously, they had Mike Zimmer as the head coach. And I've always respected Mike Zimmer as a defensive play caller. But this Vikings defense has done more when they've been asked to step up and make plays than last year's Vikings defense did. And I think that's been the big story and the big part of the turnaround. And you mentioned the close games. You mentioned the game against the Lions, right? The fact that those games are now going their way instead of against them, obviously has led to them being 5-1. And last year's Vikings team would have lost that game. And that's when we would have questioned, same old Vikings. Now, currently, their only loss is to the undefeated Philadelphia Eagles. So if you're a Vikings fan, you couldn't have schemed up this year really any better. And okay, you beat the Lions. It's nice to have a head-to-head division win. And again, the big thing for them is the week 1 victory against the Packers. They have some breathing room here too. Even if the Packers catch them, they have that win to kind of fall back on, which is a nice luxury that they haven't had. And you talk about the early coach in the year candidates, right? I feel like Kevin O'Connell has to be strongly in that consideration. I think Brian Daboll right now is the clear lead, doing more with less with what he's doing with the Giants. I imagine it's refreshing for Kirk Cousins that he doesn't have a toxic relationship with his head coach, because we know that him and Mike Zimmer clearly disagreed on a multitude of issues behind the scenes, and they had those sideline blowups. So I think those are all the factors that have led to the Viking season we're seeing to this point. I guess for the Vikings fans and the Vikings franchise, the question they have to ask themselves is, we're 5-1. Yeah, we're cruising to this NFC North title, but are we truly a franchise that's turned the corner to being a championship contender? And you look at the current state of the NFC as is. You have the Niners, who very talented team, but they've been having played their JV unit due to injuries. You look at the Eagles, undefeated right now. You look at the NFC East, and we're still trying to make sense of what the NFC East currently is constructed, because you have the Cowboys, who just dropped the game with their backup quarterback, Cooper Rush, after going, of course, 4-0 with Cooper Rush as their starting quarterback. Now they get Dak Prescott back. So how much does that improve that team? The New York Giants, at this point, they're 5-1. They face the Jags this week. They could be 6-1. they aren't going away. They'll be in the wild card picture just by virtue of their early season record. The Vikings, I like them over the Giants, but I think the hesitancy for people to buy in on the Vikings is that we always feel like they have that dumb game in them, right? We always feel like they have that, similar to what we think about when we think about the Pac-12. They always have that letdown performance in them. And that will be the true test, right? If they could go a prolonged stretch without having that game happen to them.
So Minnesota, one of my favorite stats from last year is that if we had not played the final 2 minutes of each half of the first half and the second half last season, if we had just not played them all together, if football quarters were 13 minutes long or 14 minutes long, whatever you want to say, if you take out just that 4 minutes of every game, the Vikings would have gone 15-2 last year. They would have gone 15-2 if you don't play the last 2 minutes of every game last year. And the Vikings this year have not changed their defense at all. And the reason that they are as good defensively as they've been is they have the second best turnover margin in the NFL at +4. They are forcing a lot of turnovers, and turnovers, as we know, are very sporadic year over year. I think the Eagles are +12 right now. They're like 8 turnover margin ahead of everyone else. It's like, how are the Eagles at 6-0? Probably because they are +12 in the turnover margin. And that's why their defense is top 2 in the league, because they are, I think the next closest team is the Vikings at +4 on the turnover margin. So Vikings are very much a turnover dependent defense. Those things don't carry over because turnovers can be sporadic game to game and season to season. The best comparison I can give you, and again, this might change as the season goes along, but I feel pretty confident in saying the Minnesota Vikings are last year's Cowboys. Think of that in your mind. Everything you thought about the Cowboys going into the playoffs last year and the last 5 weeks of the season, that's what this Minnesota team is. It is a team that is going to win their division more probably than not. They're going to have a 2, 3, 4 seed in the playoff, and they're in that second tier of teams. I don't know exactly who makes up the first tier other than the Eagles in the NFC, but it's all about matchup in the playoffs for Minnesota. I mean, the Cowboys coulda, shoulda, woulda beat the Niners last year, but the Cowboys were a team that was favored against the Niners, but wasn't really trusted against the Niners. And obviously they lost in a close game. Vikings are one of those teams that's going to host a playoff game. If they play Green Bay, they might be a favorite. If they play Tampa, they might be an underdog. If they play the Giants, they might be 7-point favorites. It all depends on matchup once they get to the playoffs, because like last year's Cowboys, they are incredibly turnover dependent and have a top 10 offense.
I can agree with that, because I think if they can avoid a more physical matchup or a more physical set of matchups in the playoffs, because the reason I think that they were able to win that week 1 game against the Packers is, to put it blunt with the Packers, I look at the Packers and think of a kind of a soft team. I mean, they're just not a physical team. And that's why the Niners have been able to abuse them in the playoffs in recent history, whether it be the Harbaugh administration or what they've managed to put together with Kyle Shanahan, DeMeco Ryans, Robert Saleh, all those cogs on their defense. If the Vikings were to run into a team like the Niners, assuming full strength, assuming the Niners have their guys back, I think that's a problematic matchup for them, because we saw that in the Monday night game against the Philadelphia Eagles. We know at this point that the Philadelphia Eagles defense, they're nasty. They'll get after you. That defensive line is one of the biggest strengths of that team. And that's what was a big problem for them whenever they were playing against the Vikings. And then add in, of course, that they have big play Darius Slay on the outside as well, who was blanketing Justin Jefferson. Those are the type of matchups that could pose threats to the Vikings in their hopes of making a potential Super Bowl this year. You look around the NFC, who else is going to kind of potentially challenge them? Even like a Giants team isn't completely out of the question to pose problems for Vikings, because what the Giants do well, right? Run the ball, aggressive defense, can force a turnover. Those are all kind of like things that could hurt like a Vikings team. So it's just really what the pathway to the championship is. And luckily for them, and we'll see how this plays out with like the Eagles as well, but luckily for them, they do play in this NFC North, where they've proven that they could beat the other tough team in the division, the Packers, and they should be able to beat the Vikings and Lions respectively. So similar to what the Green Bay Packers have been able to do, they might be able to get the number 1 seed potentially this year. That's still well within a range of outcomes for the Vikings, as the Eagles will have a tougher test to get there because of obviously improving division around them. And I think the Eagles' schedule is slightly tougher towards the end of the year. So I think the Vikings, the best thing that they can hope for, obviously, is wrapping up the number 1 seed. If they were able to do that, that might change completely how you look at this team going into the playoffs. It's just, again, can they avoid the letdown performances, which we know kind of are one of the big things that we associate with the Vikings and why we kind of delegitimize them as a playoff contender because of past seasons, what we've seen with this team.
I would love to watch them play the Rams in the playoffs. I would love to watch that matchup. And that might be a 7-2 or a 6-3. I mean, basically, if you want to do dumb like NFC playoffs for dummies, I will ask everyone right now. You can only have one of these teams make the playoffs, the Giants or the Rams. One team, only one can make it. Who's going to make it between those two?
Okay, but here's the thing. It's not as cut and dry as that for me, because if the Giants get to 6-1 this week facing Jacksonville, and the Rams, luckily they're on bye week, so the Rams don't have to worry about it. But the Rams come back and they face the Niners, the team they struggle with. They drop to 3-4 after that. And suddenly the Rams just might be screwed out of it by their early season results. Meanwhile, the Giants get to be in cruise control rest of the year because of what they've done in the early part of the season. 6-1, I mean, at a certain point, it just becomes harder to screw that up and not make the playoffs.
The reason I say that is because I think 6 of the NFC playoff teams are set at this point. It's the Eagles, it's Dallas, it's San Francisco, it's Tampa, it's the Vikings, and it is, who am I forgetting? Dallas, Green Bay. Green Bay is also probably going to make the playoffs. I know Green Bay has had a tough start to the season, but Green Bay is probably going to make the playoffs. And I think it's interesting to see how that plays out, because all of those 5 teams that I mentioned, and then pick your poison, Giants, Rams, maybe Cardinals turn it around, but that's another video that we released on the channel. But basically, I would say that all of those matchups propose unique and different situations for what the Vikings do, because their offense is the Rams, except Dalvin Cook is a capable running back and the Rams running game is shit. So basically, like, they are an incredibly capable offense that passing wise is very dependent on what Justin Jefferson does and Kirk Cousins' connection with Justin Jefferson. So that's a really, they have Jefferson as like a 35 to 38% usage rate, which I think Cooper Kupp is sitting around. Cooper Kupp's by far the highest in the league at like 44%. So that's what they want to do on offense. And their defense is not actually as good as the numbers suggest. They're just really good at forcing turnovers. And that's what helped them beat the Lions. It kept them in the game a couple weeks ago. And it was interesting because in this last game, the Dolphins outgained the Vikings 2-1. The Dolphins had twice as many yards of offense as the Minnesota Vikings, and the Vikings won that game kind of running away. So that's kind of a testament to like turnovers end up flipping the game 10 to 12 points at certain situations. So again, playoff matchup will be so interesting to watch for the Vikings. And I'm with you. Number 1 seed isn't out of the question and something that they should probably value a lot.
So currently they are 4-0 in 1 possession games. So that is something that, again, hasn't went the Vikings' way in the past. And that's been one of the big reasons why they've struggled to make the playoffs or be able to be certainly a contender even in their own division. As long as that maintains, I think that the Viking thing isn't an aberration, and it is something that legitimately going into this NFC playoff, they will be a team, given their offensive weapons, can pose problems for any team that's hoping to make the Super Bowl this year. But anyway, guys, what do you think of the Minnesota Vikings? How do you like them going into the playoffs? Like, what do you think this 5-1 start means for them? Do you think this makes them a legitimate Super Bowl contender or not? We'd like to hear your thoughts in the comment section. Leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel, follow us on social media from Kyle Ledbetter and Juju. Stay safe, happy, and healthy. We will see you on the next one.